The woman behind the front desk had been talking for 3 minutes straight, and not a single word had been directed at the elderly lady, standing in front of her with a paid receipt trembling in her hands. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step aside," the concierge said again, louder this time, the way people speak to someone they've already decided can't hear them. "The Langmore suite is reserved for guests with confirmed bookings." "I have a confirmed booking." The old woman's voice was thin but steady. "My son arranged it. My name is Ruth Farrell." The concierge, a sharp-boned woman named Candace Prine with a laminated smile and a clipboard pressed to her chest like a shield, checked her screen for the 3rd time and then didn't. "I don't see anything under that name." Ruth reached into her purse with shaking hands and produced a printed confirmation email. Candace didn't take it. Across the marble lobby of the Hartwell Grand, Cleo Dunbar had been waiting 30 minutes for the hotel's finance director to return her calls. She was there to drop off quarterly reconciliation files. Nothing glamorous, nothing worth remembering, but she'd learned long ago that bookkeeping work for half a dozen businesses in this neighborhood meant spending a lot of time in lobbies like this one, invisible in ways that had mostly stopped bothering her. Mostly. She was good at noticing things other people didn't bother to look at. She noticed now. The concierge had lowered her voice, but her posture hadn't changed. It was the posture of someone who had already made a decision and was simply waiting for the other person to accept it. Ruth was 70, maybe older, with silver hair pinned neatly and a coat that had once been expensive. She wasn't confused. She wasn't causing a scene. She was standing quietly with documentation in her hand, while a woman half her age refused to look at it. 2 guests in the lobby had already pulled out their phones. Cleo set her folder on the chair beside her and walked over. "Excuse me." She didn't raise her voice. She simply stood between Ruth and the desk. "What seems to be the problem?" Candace blinked. Whatever she'd expected, it wasn't this. A woman in sensible flats and a bazaya that pulled slightly at the shoulders, looking at her with the patient expression of someone who takes notes for a living and remembers everything. "This doesn't concern you." "She has a printed confirmation." Cleo gestured toward the paper Ruth was still holding. "That seems like it concerns someone." A muscle tightened in Candace's jaw. "Our system shows no reservation under Farrell." "Then your system has an error." Cleo kept her voice level. "Which happens. What doesn't need to happen is making this woman stand at a front desk and justify herself to you for 5 minutes while you look through her like she's not there." The lobby had gone very quiet. Candace's smile had curdled into something with edges. "I'll need to ask you to step back. I'm not in your way." "Security." Candace lifted 2 fingers in a small, practiced gesture. A man in a dark blazer appeared from the side corridor. "Please escort." "Touch her," Cleo said quietly. "And I'll be speaking with your general manager, your corporate ethics line, and whoever runs your social media accounts, in that order. And I'll be doing it with a photograph of a 70-year-old woman being removed from a hotel lobby because your reservation system made a mistake." She tilted her head slightly. "You want to take 30 seconds to check again?" The security guard stopped. Candace looked back at her screen, really looked this time, and clicked something. Her posture changed by a fraction. "There appears to have been an input error," she said. "The reservation is under FARRELL. 1 moment." Ruth let out a slow breath beside Cleo. Her hands had stopped shaking. She didn't say anything, but when Cleo glanced over, the old woman was looking at her with something steady and warm in her eyes. The way people look at someone they want to remember. The check-in took 4 minutes. When it was done, Cleo offered to carry one of Ruth's bags to the elevator. "You really didn't have to do that," Ruth said, once they were out of earshot. "You had documentation." Cleo shrugged. She was just hoping you wouldn't know you were right. Ruth studied her for a moment. You do that often? Step in. When it's clear. Cleo almost smiled. I'm an accountant. I spend a lot of time figuring out where things don't add up. Ruth laughed, a real laugh, soft and surprised. What's your name? Cleo Dunbar. Ruth Farrell. She shook her hand with a grip that was still firm. Thank you, Cleo. On the drive back to her office, Cleo didn't think about it much. She had a corrections report due by Thursday and a client dinner she was dreading on Friday. The hotel situation was already folding itself into the category of things that had happened, and were now finished. She didn't know that upstairs in the Langmore suite, Ruth Farrell had already taken out her phone. That evening, on the 42nd floor of a building most people in this city had never entered, Damon Farrell read a text from his mother and felt something tighten behind his sternum that had nothing to do with the 3 contracts on his desk. I had a small situation at the hotel. I'm fine. Someone helped me. Thought you should know, since you'll probably find out anyway. He called her immediately. His mother answered on the second ring and told him the story in the same unhurried way she'd always told stories. Chronologically, without drama, leaving the worst parts for last. By the time she described Candace Prince's smile and the security guard who'd been summoned, Damon had already stopped reading the contracts. Are you all right? I told you I'm fine. And the woman who stepped in. Cleo Dunbar. Ruth's voice warmed noticeably. She's an accountant. She was just there to drop off some paperwork. She didn't know me from anyone. Damon set the phone down after the call and looked at his head of security, who had been standing at the edge of the room with the professional stillness of someone paid to be invisible. The Hartwell Grand. Today. Front desk incident. I want the security footage. His chief of staff, a man named Whitmore, who had spent 11 years learning to read Damon's silences, cleared the room without being asked. The footage came in 40 minutes. Damon watched it twice. He watched Candace ignore the printed confirmation. He watched the security guard appear. He watched the 2 lobby guests lift their phones. He watched a woman in a blazer cross the marble floor and position herself between his mother and the desk. Not rushing, not performing, simply choosing, and then speak for 40 seconds that changed the entire temperature of the room. He paused it on her face. She wasn't looking at the camera. She was looking at his mother, checking that she was still all right, with the attention most people reserved for things that mattered to them. He hadn't expected that. Find her, he said. Whitmore had a tablet ready. Mrs. Dunbar does bookkeeping for several businesses in the 3rd Ward, small firm on Clement Street. And Candace Prine. Still on shift. Damon straightened his cuff. She won't be by morning. Cleo found out about the hotel manager's termination because the Hartwell Grand was one of her clients. The finance director called Thursday afternoon, apologetic and elliptical, to mention a staffing change following a guest relations incident and that a formal review was underway. She didn't connect it to Tuesday. She filed the information away and went back to her spreadsheets. On Friday, a woman she didn't recognize dropped off a small arrangement of white dahlias at the front desk with a card that read, simply, "Thank you, RF." Cleo kept them on her desk for 2 weeks. She didn't hear from Ruth again until a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks later. When the old woman appeared in the office doorway with 2 cups of coffee and a completely transparent excuse about needing help understanding a mutual fund statement. "You have a financial advisor," Cleo said, looking at the document. "He's very boring." Cleo bit back a smile. "Sit down." They spent an hour on the statement and another 30 minutes talking about things that had nothing to do with finance. Ruth was sharp and funny, and occasionally said things so precisely observant they caught Cleo off guard. She talked about her son, his work, his discipline, The fact that he'd learned to cook during a period of his life she described only as complicated, without ever mentioning what his name meant in half the city's back rooms. She came back the following Tuesday, and the one after that. Cleo stopped pretending the visits were primarily financial. "You remind me of someone I used to know," Ruth said once, watching Cleo annotate a margin with small, exact handwriting. "Who?" "Someone who never thought she deserved the space she was taking up." Ruth looked at her steadily. She was wrong about that. Cleo didn't answer. She put her pen down and stared at the page for a moment, and Ruth let the silent sense sit there without filling it. That was the thing about Ruth Farrell. She didn't push. She simply made space and waited to see what you'd do with it. Damon walked into her office on a Wednesday morning because he had a ledger that needed reviewing, and her firm was 2 blocks from a meeting. That was the reason he gave himself. It wasn't entirely a lie. When Cleo came out to the lobby, she was reading something on her tablet and didn't look up immediately. When she did, she registered his suit, his posture, and the expensive quietness that serious men carry like a second coat, and her expression was professionally neutral. Mr. Farrell? He'd used his real name on the visitor form. He'd wanted to see what she did with it. She didn't do anything with it. She extended her hand. "Cleo Dunbar, come on back." Her office was small and ordered. There was a plant on the windowsill doing well. No photographs on the desk, but 3 different kinds of sticky notes color-coded in a way that was clearly systematic. A small pot of yellow flowers he didn't recognize sat on the sill where the dahlias had been. She opened the ledger he'd brought and started asking questions. Precise questions. The kind that suggested she'd already seen what the numbers were supposed to say and had started wondering about the gap. "This column," she said, tapping a line without looking up, "it doesn't reconcile with the depreciation schedule on page 8. "No," Damon said, "it doesn't." She looked up. Something in his tone had shifted. She studied him the way she'd studied the ledger, carefully, without performance. "You knew that already." "I wanted to see how long it would take you." She set the pen down. "About 40 seconds. "That's what I was told." A beat of quiet. "My mother speaks very highly of you," he said. Something shifted in her expression, not surprise, but a careful recalibration. "Ruth is your mother?" "Yes." She looked at the ledger, then back at him. The ledger was a pretext. Partly. Which part was real? "The gratitude," he said, "and the curiosity." Cleo leaned back in her chair. She didn't seem frightened. She didn't seem particularly impressed either, which was unusual enough that he noticed it. She seemed to be deciding something. "I didn't do anything remarkable," she said finally. She had a confirmation number. The desk agent was ignoring it. It wasn't a complicated situation. Most people walk past complicated situations. Most people don't want the inconvenience. She met his eyes. "I don't like watching people get steamrolled because someone decided they don't count." He was quiet for a moment. He was thinking about the footage, the way she'd crossed that lobby, unhurried, choosing, and about the years he'd spent in rooms full of people who calculated before they moved. This woman had moved first and figured out what she'd need while she was already standing at the desk. "Would you have dinner with me?" he asked. She blinked. First time she'd looked surprised. "I'm sorry?" "Dinner. Tonight, or whenever you're available." He said it the way he said most things, directly, without decoration, and watched her process it. "Mr. Farrell." She said his name carefully. "You don't know anything about me. I know you stood in front of a security guard without flinching for a woman you'd never met. I know you can find a discrepancy in a depreciation schedule in under a minute. I know my mother has been here 4 times in 3 weeks, and she doesn't repeat things she doesn't genuinely want." He paused. "I'd like to know the rest." The yellow-flowered plant sat on the windowsill between them. Cleo looked at her hands for a moment. A small gesture, almost imperceptible, the kind people make before saying something they've kept to themselves for a long time. "I'm going to be straight with you," she said. "Men who look like you, who run whatever it is you actually run, and I have a fairly good guess, don't usually sit across from women who look like me and mean it when they say dinner." Something in Damon's expression shifted. Not irritation, something quieter than that. "I'm looking at you right now," he said. "I've been looking at you since I walked in." He didn't say it like a compliment designed to move a conversation forward. He said it like a fact he wanted her to have. "You are also, if you'd like the full report, the most genuinely beautiful woman I've been in a room with in a long time. That's not separate from everything else. It's part of the same thing." The room was very still. Cleo looked at him for a long moment. He held the look without flinching. "Okay," she said. "Okay? Dinner." The corner of her mouth moved. "But I'm picking the restaurant." Candace Prine's termination had been processed quietly, as most things connected to Damon Farrell were processed. She'd assumed, wrongly, that the matter was closed. It wasn't until the Hartwell Grand's parent company published its internal review findings, naming the incident explicitly, announcing a zero-tolerance policy update, and attaching documentation of 2 additional complaints from former staff, that she understood the size of what had moved against her. The review was public. Her name was in it. The document was thorough and sourced, and would follow her professional record for years. She made one attempt to confront Cleo about it. It happened outside the small restaurant where Cleo and Ruth had lunch every other week. Candace appeared on the sidewalk with the composure of someone who'd rehearsed what she intended to say and had failed to account for the possibility that it wouldn't land. "You had no idea what you were getting involved in," Candace said. Cleo was holding a takeout bag and Ruth's umbrella. She looked at her without particular heat. "I knew exactly what I was getting involved in," she said. "A woman with a confirmation number being told she didn't have one. That was the whole situation. You cost me my career. You did that yourself." Cleo's voice stayed even. "You had her documentation in front of you for 4 minutes. You chose not to read it. Everything after that was a consequence of that one choice." She shifted the bag. "I'd suggest not making the same choice twice." She walked past her. Ruth was waiting inside. She had, Cleo noticed, clearly heard every word through the glass door and was wearing the expression of a woman exercising tremendous restraint. "You didn't need to do that," Ruth said. "I know." Cleo sat down and opened the bag. She needed to hear it anyway. 6 months later, the shared office on Clement Street was too small. Cleo had not asked Damon for anything. She'd made that clear early, in the 3rd week, when the full shape of what he was had become visible. The kind of clarity that comes from watching someone operate at a distance, and then seeing them close up and realizing both versions are accurate. She hadn't run. She hadn't pretended either. She'd said, "I need you to understand that I built this from nothing and I'm going to keep building it. I'm not going to let it become something else because of who you are." He'd said, "Good." The new office had happened because 3 clients referred her to 4 more, which led to a contract with a property management group, which led to a conversation with a hotel chain's regional CFO that resulted in the kind of retainer she'd spent 6 years working toward. Word had traveled, as it does, through the networks of people who pay attention to, who handles problems quietly and correctly. She hired 2 people. She painted the walls a shade of green, her first assistant said, looked like a plant store had detonated, which Cleo took as a compliment. The yellow-flowered pot from her old windowsill moved to the new one. On a Sunday evening in late October, Damon stood in her kitchen and made pasta from scratch in the unhurried way he did most things that mattered to him. and Cleo sat on the counter with a glass of wine and her tablet, reviewing a client file, and neither of them said anything for a long time because they didn't need to. Ruth had called earlier to ask if they were coming Thursday. She'd added at the end that she'd made room at the table, which both of them understood meant she'd rearranged the chairs so there were 2 places side by side. Cleo had said yes before Damon finished the sentence. She'd spent most of her life believing that rooms like this, warm rooms, calm rooms, rooms where someone was making something good and expected her to stay, weren't rooms she was supposed to end up in. She'd learned to make herself smaller so the subtraction wouldn't sting when it came. It hadn't come. What had come instead was an old woman with a coffee cup and a transparent excuse about a mutual fund statement. And then a man who had looked at her across a small desk and said, "Both things are true at the same time," without blinking. And then the slow accumulation of ordinary Sundays until ordinariness became the most extraordinary thing she owned. Outside, the city moved through its evening the same way it always had. Indifferent, enormous, full of lobbies and split-second decisions, and moments where a person either crosses the room or doesn't. Cleo had crossed the room. The rest, it turned out, had crossed back.